Welcome back. Well, in order to evaluate possible outcomes regarding the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin, who is scheduled to attend the BRICS summit in August, President Cyril Ramaphosa has established an inter-ministerial committee. Now, Minister in the Presidency, Khumbudzo Ntshavheni, says the cabinet convened on Wednesday to examine the very same topic, among other things, in a post-cabinet briefing in Pretoria on Friday. She says that the cabinet confirmed South Africa's continued membership in the ICC and its continued ratification of the Rome Statute. The nation is required to abide by the warrant as a participant in the court in The Hague. Well, let's look at the legal implications of whichever decision is made by the committee and how they will impact the country. We speak to UCT's Head of Public Law, Professor Cathleen Powell. Kathy, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us this morning. The Rome Statute is quite clear. You know, any failure to execute an issued warrant of arrest will be perceived as impunity. How does South Africa get around something quite as clear as that?
We don't. The only grey area in the Rome Statute is a possible conflict between Article 27 of the statute, which says there's no such thing as state immunity or sovereign immunity, which is what Putin would be claiming, and Article 98, which says that the International Criminal Court itself should not put any of its member states in a position where they have to break an obligation to a third state. Now, Russia probably counts as a third state because it's not a signatory to the convention. So it's possible that South Africa has a complaint against the ICC saying you should not have put us in this position. But the point is that the ICC has put South Africa in this position. And both the Rome Statute, the case law of the ICC, and our own legislation, and indeed our own jurisprudence, our own case law from the Supreme Court of Appeal, all say that South Africa is bound to give effect to this arrest warrant. We don't even have a choice.
Yeah. It's interesting because at some point it did appear as though Ramaphosa's administration, his government, was considering some sort of hybrid session when it comes to the BRICS summit, wherein Russian President Vladimir Putin wouldn't have to or wouldn't be required to be physically present for the summit, but could otherwise join via virtual means. I wonder if that would still be perceived by the ICC as an attempt by South Africa to circumvent its own obligations when it comes to this issued warrant of arrest.
No, it wouldn't. That would be a superb solution because South Africa is only under an obligation to arrest Vladimir Putin if it has its hands on him, if he's in the country. So there might be some complaints that South Africa is having anything to do with Vladimir Putin or Russia at all, but there's no legal obligation not to. Mm-hmm. The legal obligation imposed by the Rome Statute is arrest him if we ask you to, and is in your territory. So I think a hybrid solution would be, a hybrid meeting would be excellent.
Right. Now, I started out with a pretty strong word, impunity. And I wonder, Kathy, whether or not other countries who have disregarded warrants of arrest issued by the ICC, whether or not they've actually been dealt with for their perceived impunity. I know South Africa was one such country in 2016 when we allowed former Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir to leave the country. We haven't really faced any sort of repercussions for that course of action. So really, is it anything that we should be taking that seriously, I suppose?
Well, international lawyers always get a little bit hot under the collar when somebody says to them, oh, well, you can't enforce it, so it's not international law. Put it this way, we can get away with it. In international relations terms, we join a long and dishonorable tradition of many African states and the African Union itself, which has said, no, we're not cooperating with the ICC. Well, that's certainly what they said about al-Bashir. So we can do it too. Last time there was a motion of censure against South Africa. It didn't cost us anything immediately. This time we have even better chances, because if the ICC really wants a state to be forced to cooperate, it has to ask the Security Council to help it. And guess who's chair of the Security Council at the moment and has veto power over its decisions? That's Russia. So in practical sort of short-term terms, we can ignore them. We can just pretend they don't matter. In longer term terms, any state, and even the USA has proven this, does itself enormous damage by thumbing its nose, by showing contempt for international law per se, but in particular for the treaty obligations that it itself has taken on. We're not even talking about this obligation as a matter of customary law, which is the unwritten, unsigned law. We're talking about this matter as something that South Africa negotiated, was one of the founding signatories and ratified many years ago, and has passed into domestic law. This becomes a rule of law issue. And if our government can do it, why not everybody? And what has been discovered in rule of law research is that in any state where the government is not complying with the law, the citizens stop complying with the law.
Yeah.
And in the global, just one more point. In the global community at the moment, when we have so much conflict breaking out, Ukraine, Russia, Sudan, we've got little hotspots, we've got conflagrations all over the world. We want to know that there's an institution that's going to hold lawbreakers to account. And if we're not supporting that institution, we're letting the whole world into a more uncertain future.
Yeah, that lens of global polarity, Kathy, is very important when looking at this particular story and its developments. But notwithstanding the whiplash that I think South Africans have from all the vacillating around whether or not we're in and out of the Rome Statute, listening to the ANC's briefing on the outcomes of its NEC meeting this past weekend, certainly the president's own utterances next to his Finnish counterpart, President Sauli Niinisto, it does appear that the ANC, as the governing party, is quite determined to have South Africa sort of out of the snares of the Rome Statute, even though we know that process was started and then withdrawn, and in and of itself is quite a lengthy process. Does the expressed intention alone create some kind of immunity in the long run to say that as a sovereign state, South Africa was growing towards the idea of no longer forming part of the Rome Statute? Does that in any way offer any kind of immunity?
No, it doesn't, because if South Africa does decide to withdraw from the ICC, externally it's a fairly simple process. It merely needs to tell the ICC Secretariat that it is withdrawing, and that withdrawal then takes a year. You just have to wait, and then a year later we'll be out in the cold. The problem is that any obligations that we had at the time we made the announcement, and any obligations that we pick up in the course of that year while we're waiting, still bind South Africa. So Vladimir Putin does not have the right not to be arrested in South Africa. Let's put it that way. Let me just explain why there is a little bit of a grey area. The International Court of Justice has said that heads of state have sovereign immunity even when you're talking about international crimes. But they were dealing with a case in which one state wanted to prosecute somebody who had sovereign immunity within its own courts. What we're being asked to do here is to surrender somebody to the ICC. That's a different matter. So that the fact that the International Court of Justice seems to have suggested that sovereign immunity still exists even in cases like these, that's where we've got a little bit of grey area and wriggle room. But there is a slight difference, and we've got our own Supreme Court of Appeal and the ICC saying no, we've got to arrest sovereign heads of state if there's an arrest warrant for them, and even if those heads of state have not, even if the state concerned has not waived its immunity.
Yeah, it does appear that everything in our domestic law and our own jurisprudence is working against whatever expressed intention the ANC may have with regards to this thorny issue around Vladimir Putin. A country that does not have that same dilemma is, of course, Russia. They're not a member state when it comes to the Rome Statute. Is that the reason why the ICC hasn't been able to execute its own warrant of arrest simply by going over to Russia and apprehending the president?
Well, the ICC relies very strongly on the cooperation of its member states. It doesn't have its own police force. So it can only ever arrest anybody by issuing a warrant for arrest for that person and sending it to a cooperative state. So it can't send anything to Putin in Russia because nobody there has to do anything about it. They're not bound. They're not a party. But it can send the warrant of arrest to any member state that Putin then visits. Right. And in an ideal world, Putin would then find his chances severely limited and notice, maybe I shouldn't commit war crimes, or maybe I should cooperate here. The more member states that actually stick to their original undertakings, the stronger the rule of law and the fight against impunity becomes. But the ICC is pretty helpless without us. And South Africa, there's no way it can get out of its obligation to arrest Putin. But with all this talk of the ANC, it's starting to say that in the future, don't worry, we're not going to help the ICC anymore. And states that people that are suspected, in fact not suspected but indicted, there's been a warrant of arrest, of very serious crimes. In this case, we're dealing with the kidnapping and deportation of children. They can come to us without any problem, and we don't really care.
Right. Talking about another entity that doesn't have its own policing arm to effect such warrants of arrest, Western Cape Premier Alan Winde coming out with some very interesting remarks on Freedom Day, noting that his Western Cape government, through its provincial government-funded law enforcement advancement plan, would in fact arrest Russian President Vladimir Putin if he was to set foot in the Western Cape. Your thoughts on that? I mean, is there any credence to that? Is that even a possibility?
No, it sounds good, but they could arrest him once there was a warrant for arrest issued within South Africa. But to get that, you need the central government's cooperation. The way it works is that the warrant arrest gets sent to what's called the Central Authority in South Africa. That's going to be the Director General of Justice, if I recall correctly. And that Director General then has to, there's no discretion, immediately convey the request for an arrest to the nearest magistrate, and that magistrate has to issue a warrant of arrest once satisfying him or herself of a couple of sort of technical requirements. So, yes, the Western Cape police could do the arrest if they had the warrant of arrest. Our problem will lie in the South African government doing what it did with al-Bashir, which is nothing. And the only reason al-Bashir came to court, or the concept came to court last time, was that civil society brought an application against the government to the courts to get that warrant of arrest issued.
Well, Professor Powell, as insightful as always, thank you so much for your time and coming on to today's program. That was UCT's Head of Public Law, Professor Cathleen Powell.